Hello and welcome to this lecture co-organised by the Royal Air Force Museum and the Centre for War and Diplomacy at Lancaster University. I'm the RAF Museum's historian, Dr. Harry Rafal, and it's my pleasure tonight to be joined by the CWD's Dr. Marco Weiss and also our speaker, Maria Brzezinska. So real pleasure to have them with us, but also, of course, to have all of you with us. So many thanks for joining us wherever you are joining from. Tonight we have guests from Lagos, Ljubljana, and even Lancaster itself. So many thanks for joining us. And Marco, will you please introduce the centre and Maria?
Thank you very much for the introduction, Harry, and welcome to you all. So on behalf of Lancaster University Centre for War and Diplomacy, short CWD, I would like to say we're absolutely delighted to be running this lecture series in partnership with the Royal Air Force Museum, and particularly to co-organise this very talk by Dr. Maria Eva Brzezinska. Yet before introducing tonight's speaker and talk, please allow me to say a few words about the Centre for War and Diplomacy. The CWD provides the historical context and strategic analysis that will inform understanding of current global challenges, as well as those of the future. It embraces a global perspective. The CWD pursues research into the mutually informative field of war and diplomatic relations between states, and does so in the longue durée, because it wants to achieve cross-chronological insights. Based in the Department of History at Lancaster University, the CWD brings together colleagues from across Lancaster University's Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, and it has a dynamic community of honorary researchers, a flourishing cohort of doctoral students, and welcomes visiting fellows from across the world. In addition to research and engagement activities, the CWD also pursues a teaching agenda. Since 2019, we have supported and hosted the MA in International and Military History, and we are going to launch the interdisciplinary MA in War and Diplomacy, which will be jointly run with our colleagues from the Department of Politics, Philosophy and Religion. We are currently welcoming applications to these two programs for next academic year, and please do not hesitate getting in touch if you have any questions. As student on our MAs, we obviously benefit from the CWD's program of conferences, seminars and talks. Moreover, in addition to running and co-organizing events such as the one today, we are producing the War and Diplomacy podcast series, and all our podcasts are available on Spotify, Anchor, and Apple. Please feel free to check them out. In my role as Deputy Director of CWD, it is now my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Maria Eva Brzezinska. Maria is currently a lecturer in air power studies at the University of Wolverhampton, where she's primarily involved in designing and delivering an online course on air power, space power, and cyber warfare.
I assume the problem is that his
a PhD
rather than ours. So whilst we wait to get Marco back, who's going to host the Q&A, should say I'm really looking forward to your lecture. Delighted to be joined by you, air power historian at the University of Wolverhampton and a former recipient of the Royal Air Force. Yes?
I think we didn't lose Marco. I could still see him.
Can you?
Yeah, and as can our audience, I think.
Oh,
you could hear me, Maria?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So, well, Harry.
Apologies.
Okay, so where was I? Sorry to everyone about that. That's the danger, of course, of these online events. So coming back to Maria, so she obtained her PhD from the University of Nottingham, where she worked on a project focused on European air power and its involvement in different forms of multinational cooperation. Her thesis, titled The Potential and Limits of Air Power in Contemporary Multinational Operations, the Case of the UK, Polish and Swedish Air Forces, and of course that's very much related to tonight's talk, I think, is making an important contribution to the field of air power studies, which remains to date largely dominated by the US case. Her research is of course significant, and it has been recognized by the Royal Air Force Museum, awarding her the museum's RAF Centenary PhD bursary in air power studies in 2019. Maria also holds a master's degree in national security from the National Defense University, currently War Studies University in Warsaw, Poland. And it was that experience that for her was a turning point, as it stimulated her interest in military and air power capabilities of European states and motivated her to pursue further studies in that field. Currently, she is preparing a new research project which will build upon one of the core aspects studied in her doctoral thesis, the influence of national culture on the military culture of European air forces. So in today's virtual lecture, entitled Complexity of Integration, Challenges of Multinational Operations Encountered by Small Air Forces, Dr. Bożynska will assess the possible challenges small European air forces might encounter in multinational operations. I'm really looking forward to her talk because, among many reasons, she is one of rather few experts on small European air forces. The focus is on the air forces of, on the one hand, a NATO member state and on the other, a neutral country. Numerous small European air forces have recently been procuring new aircraft, such as the F-35, or are in the process of procuring it. And I think I don't really have to emphasize the talk's relevance in light of the trouble in Ukraine, a militarily threatening Russia, and Europe's continued strategic cacophony. Thank you very much for giving this talk for the CWD RAF Museum Lecture Series, Maria. Please, the floor, or rather the screen, is yours.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Marco, and thank you, Harry, for inviting me here. It's an absolute pleasure to speak today after what was like 2 years of continuous lockdowns. So, Harry, if you could bring the slides up, please. Great, perfect. Thank you very much. Right. So, what's so special about multinational operations? Well, they are by far the most frequent form of military operations today, and some of the reasons for such situation are shrinking defense budgets, downsizing the armed forces, and emerging of new unconventional threats, so that individual states they can no longer afford to deal with all the potential security challenges on their own. But also, multinational operations are very complex, as you would expect. So that complexity stems from the fact that they are bringing together units from various nations. And these nations, they come from different cultural backgrounds, they speak different languages, they represent different national objectives, they operate according to different procedures, and they use different equipment, which is not necessarily compatible. And even if those nations are involved in a multinational organization, for example, NATO, that does not necessarily remove all the potential challenges they may face. And today I'd like to talk about these challenges, which may be encountered by especially the small European air forces. And I also want to hint on how these challenges could be overcome. So this lecture is based predominantly on my doctoral thesis, which was, as Mark already mentioned, on the potential and limitations of European air power in multinational operations. And as I structured it around the 3 case studies of the UK, Sweden, and Poland, today, when I refer to the small air forces, I will be mostly referring to the Polish and Swedish Air Force. However, as you will notice, occasionally, I will also mention some other examples just to illustrate my point. So, what are small air forces? How do I understand the term? Well, definitely, it is a very debatable term, and it can be looked at from very different perspectives. So we can look at it from the perspective of the size. So we look at the numbers of the equipment, numbers of personnel. But it could be also looked at from the perspective of capabilities. So what this particular air force is capable of doing. And I found that the latter approach, the capabilities approach, is the dominant one in the literature of the subject. So here I'm following the classification suggested by Sanukai Nikara, who identified 4 categories of air forces. And then we have US as the standalone category. We have large, small, and niche air forces. And they differ from one another depending on the scope of their capabilities, their ability to pursue operations independently for a longer time. And they differ also on the existence of indigenous industry supporting their national efforts. Therefore, according to this classification, the small air forces, they possess capabilities to perform the full spectrum of air power roles, but in a limited capacity and within limited time frame. So in other words, they do not have enough resources to independently operate at the required level for a long time. And both Polish and Swedish Air Force, they fit into this category. So they possess the full spectrum of capabilities, allowing them to perform within each of the 4 fundamental air power roles. So it's the control of the air, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, ISR, attack, and air mobility. However, due to the limited capacity, they are not able to perform these roles independently on a large scale and for an extended period of time. They also possess an industrial capacity supporting their national air power. And this is the third and final factor in this classification. So, of course, in the case of the Swedish Air Force, this is quite obvious. They've got the globally known Saab, which develops a number of different solutions for the Air Force, like, for example, the Gripen fighters. But also Poland still has some capability, some industrial capability, and it's based in Mielec or in Świdnik, where they produce their own multi-role helicopters, their own transportation aircraft, and they also take part in production of Black Hawk helicopters. Therefore, we can agree that, well, these 2 cases, they do fit the definition of small air force as suggested here. Okay, so now to the challenges to multinational military operations. Of course, well, as you would expect, there is a number of various challenges which an air force may encounter in a multinational setting. And I think a good point to start to look at them is the US JP 316 Multinational Operations publication. It's a very comprehensive approach to the complexity of this kind of operations. And it covers a broad spectrum of issues which should be addressed in order to build efficient cooperation with other nations. I think there's over 30 of them discussed in this publication. So, of course, well, I won't go through all of them because, well, we would have to stay here until spring, I think. But what's important for this publication, they are not only limited to Air Force, they are also applicable to Navy and Army and Special Forces, and they are not independent from each other. So even though they are discussed independently, separately, they do not happen separately. Most likely one will lead into another, and they will happen in different configurations after the operation has started. So what seems to be a problem, to be the challenge for the small European air forces? In this research, I decided to group these challenges into 4 main categories. And these are communication and interpersonal relations, language, national caveats and rules of engagement, and interoperability. And that's both in terms of procedures and technology. So let's start with the first one. In my research, I approached this category, the communication and interpersonal relations, from the perspective of culture, of the national culture, and the cultural diversity within the operation. And this is an absolutely fascinating topic, and I'm afraid I will only scratch the surface here today. Partially, it's because it's a really broad subject and it deserves a standalone lecture. And partially because it's my next project. So it's a little bit work in progress at the moment. However, I'd like to share my preliminary thoughts with you here. And hopefully in the future, I will have more detailed conclusions to share in some other lecture. So in my early observations on that, I found that these difficulties in communication and interpersonal relations are mostly dependent on one's level of acceptance for rigid authoritarian hierarchy, their need for clear set rules, their tolerance for ambiguous situations where some dose of flexibility and quick decision-making may be necessary. And what's important to mention here is that these terms, these factors I've just listed, they are associated in the literature with national culture and the studies on national culture. And of course, well, you could argue now that, well, military culture is a different thing. It's a uniform thing. And I dare to say, well, yes, it is uniform to some extent. It shares certain characteristics like bureaucracy, hierarchy, similar structures, discipline, ethos, a sense of communal character. But it's also highly influenced by national culture. Therefore those traits from national culture, they will still transpire into the military environment. It will be to lesser or larger extent, but there will be still there. I can illustrate this point with a study I found on command and leadership challenges in multinational operations. This study was conducted among British personnel involved in various military missions and coming from all different military services, so that it wasn't only limited to air forces. And they reported that they were given the right to make decisions, the authority to make decisions on a much lower level of military hierarchy than other participating nations. So, for example, for the British, it was the rank of captain or major, and for some other nations, it could be lieutenant colonel, who would often need to seek an additional confirmation from the higher ranks, which would, of course, slow down the decision-making process. Another example here comes from a case study of bilateral cooperation between German and Dutch officers at the NATO Corps headquarters in Münster. And they very explicitly admitted, both of the sides, that different military cultures, more authoritarian among the Germans and more relaxed among the Dutch, increased the feeling of otherness in both groups. And this also led to some misunderstandings, such as perceiving the less strict side as rude or disobedient. So communication problems and misunderstandings, even on a very basic level, they can cause delays in decision-making process, especially if the authorization from superiors is needed. And multinational military operations, they often have a decentralized command and decision-making structure, exactly to allow them to be run effectively and to eliminate the need to wait for the decision from those higher ranks, just in case, if something unexpected happens or some emergency happens. And some studies actually shown that such an approach may put some nations, which, because of their cultural background, are used to and expecting some more rigid hierarchy, in somewhat uncomfortable situation. So they would be perhaps unwilling to assume leading positions, or very uncomfortable making decisions in fast-changing circumstances. And that would also disrupt the smooth organization and running of such a multinational venture. Finally, it may be potentially difficult for a commander to work with personnel from different countries with different backgrounds that underwent different training and that adhere to different tactics or strategies. And that, of course, goes both ways, because the participating states may be resistant to delegate their air forces under foreign command, fearing that the very same differences in training, practice, cultural language, will increase the risk their personnel is exposed to. Therefore, it's not only cultural diversity, but also national interest that can pose potential difficulties for conducting these multinational air operations. And I'll move to that when we discuss the national caveats. Now, I've just said that communication is disrupted or can be hindered by cultural background. It can also, obviously, be disrupted with language and the different languages used in a coalition or in a multinational setting. Now, you could ask me, what's the problem here? Because, well, English is the common language in aviation, both military and civilian. So what's wrong with that? Being able to speak common language is already part of air power culture, and being able to communicate in English is absolutely crucial for all the personnel, just to ensure smooth running of the operation. And that's absolutely true. According to one of my interviewees, for example, in case of Poland, it has become the second nature to speak English. So the pilots and other personnel, they talk in Polish up to the point when they board aircraft. And the very moment the cockpit is closed, it's only English. So it's very likely that it will be applicable for other nations, especially if they are regularly involved in multinational operations, to automatically switch between two languages. But the challenge here is that reaching such level of proficiency to be able to naturally switch from one language to another is a very lengthy process. And it requires fundamental preparation of the military personnel. What is more, it's an ongoing process. So the new recruits are required to reach the desired level of proficiency. And lack of such preparation results in a seriously disrupted communication within a coalition, and may be one of the major flaws in getting the military personnel ready for deployments. So gaining sufficient language knowledge may prove to be especially difficult when an Air Force cooperates with a established structure like NATO, which is using its own specific terminology, phraseology, abbreviations, acronyms. For example, Bulgaria experienced such problems during its various military involvements with NATO. I found a study where 64% of the respondents, these were Bulgarian Army and Air Force officers, which were who were serving in various peace support operations with NATO. They admitted that the language training they received was insufficient, and mostly in terms of military terminology and acronyms. Sweden tried to anticipate such a situation. They when they started the post-Cold War transformation of the Swedish Air Force, it involved extensive efforts to increase their interoperability with NATO. So, for example, they were incorporating in the Swedish air doctrines and national publications references to NATO publications. They were introducing the terminology used by the alliance. So, but that process was much more comprehensive than just standardizing the national publications. Because in order to increase that interoperability, they adapted English as the operational language in the Swedish Air Force. And what is interesting, one of my interviewers said that learning English was the requirement, not only for military personnel, but for all the other civilians working in the base. And that was including even the cleaning staff. And that language preparation also involved some special courses for the pilots to familiarize, especially with NATO phraseology and glossary used during the missions. So they were thoroughly prepared for what was coming. However, it didn't always work out well. There were some glitches, as you would expect. And one of my interviewees, he recalled a situation when the Swedish Air Force was going through a transformation, switching from Swedish to English, and also adapting to the imperial unit system. And there was an exercise in the north of the country. And before that exercise, the Swedish pilots, they had to go on a course and take a test on phraseology and acronyms used in NATO, just to make sure that they are able to communicate. And during the exercise, a command was given, meaning that everybody should go back to the base and land. However, that particular command wasn't on the list. They were studying. Therefore, after 10-15 minutes, a pilot just found himself alone on the radio frequency and had to ask the air traffic control what's going on and what is he supposed to do. Luckily, it was only exercise. Therefore, ongoing language preparation is crucial before the deployment, just in order to avoid such problems as much as possible. But the language barrier, it may exist not only due to the lack of preparation or insufficient knowledge of the language, but also because of different accents and pronunciation. You've got the best example here. Or simply confidence and proficiency in speaking foreign language. So mastering the grammar and learning the vocabulary does not necessarily guarantee smooth communication flow among the members of the team. It is equally important to be able to convey the information so it's understood and interpreted in the same way by every member of the coalition. And interestingly, and it's something that I didn't thought really before it was pointed out to me in the interviews, the language barrier is also relevant for English native speakers. And the problem was highlighted to me by one of my interviewees from the RAF, who recalled the situation when he was flying close air support mission for French special forces in Afghanistan during ISAF. And even though English was commonly spoken, the communication was still hindered because of the different accents, which were even more difficult to understand because of the air masks the fighter pilots are required to wear. And another and final point on language, and the factor which may potentially increase the language barrier in multinational operations, is preference given to one's native language, especially in conversations within national units. And now we will say, well, of course, it should not be surprising that even with sufficient knowledge of English, members of the coalition often resort to speaking their native languages in informal conversations. Yeah, that's true. However, it can lead to potential problems at the higher levels. For example, when information given at joint meetings is to be passed on to individual units and it is communicated in native languages, it may be mistranslated or misunderstood. And several studies have also shown that, for example, members of multinational coalitions can also tend to speak their native language when under pressure, when acting in emergencies. And all of this can have major drawbacks. So firstly, the frequent use of native languages may increase divisions between the participating nations and effectively disintegrate the team. And secondly, it could lead to disruptions in the flow of information and disruptions in smooth cooperation. So, in addition to a language barrier and cultural background, also national caveats and adherence to diverse rules of engagement can also lead to potential challenges and misunderstandings. So here you can see the definitions for both caveats and rules of engagement. They come from the NATO glossary. So implementing national caveats is a norm in multinational operations. So what are the reasons for them? What are they for? Well, maintaining national control is one of the basic reasons for imposing caveats. Another reason may also be minimizing costs and risks that the military forces may face. Moreover, it can be a very clear reflection of domestic politics. And as such, caveats may be used as a way to find compromise between political parties which may be representing opposing views on the particular military involvement. Or they may be a way of ensuring that any action performed by the deployed forces will not contradict the national interests of the deploying country. And speaking of that, with the omnipresence of media and undisturbed information flow, which we all enjoy, states participating in multinational operations may impose caveats on their deployed forces in order to protect their good image in the eye of public opinion, especially if the operation is unpopular among the society. And finally, these caveats may originate again from the cultural background. So the extent of a state's involvement in an operation therefore may vary depending on their priorities or perception of what is appropriate or what is expected in that particular situation. Now, rules of engagement, they have a double purpose. So firstly, they provide the deployed units with clear guidelines on how to use force in specified circumstances, and they set legal boundaries within which the performed activity is considered as appropriate. Secondly, even though they are issued primarily for the use of the commander, they also serve as a tool for the governing authorities to ensure that the military force is employed according to set political goals. So, as I already explained, both caveats and rules of engagement imposed on a nation's air force reflect the state's national interest and policy priorities, and therefore are very likely rooted in the cultural background. To illustrate that, a very good example is the Swedish involvement in the Operation Unified Protector in Libya, 2011. The Swedish Air Force was tasked with reconnaissance missions in Libya, and they did an absolutely superb job. They provided very high quality images, allowing, for example, for measuring the level of oil in oil tanks. However, their activities were also very much constrained by the mandate issued by the Swedish government. So the government allowed for the enforcement of no-fly zones, but without the option to resort to offensive action. They basically wanted to rule out collateral damage. And it wasn't surprising. It wasn't surprising that they took this stance because it was the first expeditionary mission in 50 years where Swedish fighter jets were deployed. So as you would expect, the strict mandate was closely adhered to by the Swedish Air Force to ensure the ongoing public support for the decision of sending them to Libya. But in practice, it meant they were allowed to take reconnaissance pictures, but not to get involved in any combat mission, no matter how significant the targets might have been encountered. And one of my interviewees referred here to a situation when the Swedish Air Force, while performing a reconnaissance mission, encountered Libyan opposition forces being cut off in fight by Gaddafi's troops and trying to hold an oil pipeline. And because of their mandate, the Swedish could not support the forces on the ground, even though the target was very clear. So as the operation progressed, the Swedish mandate was slightly widened from a defensive air campaign to providing tactical ISR for the Joint Force Command. And initially, the Swedish Air Force was tasked to perform reconnaissance missions against targets important for maintaining no-fly zones. So these were mostly ammunition stores and airfields. However, it was still somewhat limited because it did not include attacking these targets, which normally would be considered as a part of no-fly zone enforcement mission. But the Swedish weren't allowed to do that. At some point, a delegation from Swedish government visited Sigonella base where the Swedish contingent was stationed. And the delegates were shown footage that the Swedes took. And it was a footage of an attack performed by Gaddafi's forces on a hospital. It was really a nasty one. And after that, the mandate was widened. So it involved the collection of data and reconnaissance missions against any type of target, not only related to no-fly zones. And at that point, it became obvious that if Sweden wanted to uphold the humanitarian status of the mission, they couldn't be too selective in the choice of targets for the reconnaissance. And they had to include in the reports not only threats to no-fly zones, but also threats to civilians, providing the coalition with essential and accurate data for more effective airstrikes. And this example is a perfect illustration of how a country's political will and the national caveats may constrain an air force contribution and their effectiveness in a multinational operation. And as you would expect, such situation may also increase the willingness of other nations involved in the coalition to exclude those air forces, which present a lot of such limitations. And reportedly, unfortunately, Swedish Air Force experienced that in Libya. During that very initial, very restricted phase of its deployment, Swedish diplomats and officers were not allowed to participate in classified meetings at all command levels. So that only happened after they widened the mandate. And imposing too many caveats on one's forces may very likely lead to increased burden put on other participants. And that effectively will cause discontent between the contingents and disruption in a coalition. Now, moving to rules of engagement. problems in cooperation may arise here when different countries have conflicting approaches to the same problem. And it could be a result of their foreign policy priorities or the extent of their engagement. And achieving a universal understanding of rules of engagement is often seen as the biggest challenge in multinational operations. So, for example, if the countries have differing understanding or differing interpretation of UN resolutions, it will cause disruption, because what is an authorized action for one state may be an excessive use of force for the other. And similarly, they may have different perceptions of what is self-defense, or who to regard as combatant and non-combatant in, for example, irregular operations. And speaking of air forces specifically, allocating targeting authority is a pertinent example of differing rules of engagement. And I already hinted to that when I was talking about the communication and interpersonal relations. But I will just repeat now that some nations, they may grant this directly to the pilots, while others require approval from a higher rank, sometimes even the Ministry of Defense. But also these rules they can change depending on the situation. So, for example, during the operation Enduring Freedom in Kosovo, British targeting authority was initially placed with the Secretary of State for Defense. But as the operation progressed, it proved to be ineffective and very time-consuming. So the authority was passed on to the pilots. In contrast, during the British involvement in Iraq, targeting authority was moved in the opposite direction. So in 2003, it was with the pilots, and a few months later, it was moved up the command chain as the operation became a bit less dynamic. So, if the rules of engagement are not standardized, its diversification, just like with the national caveats, it may seriously hinder the effectiveness of the mission. It may undermine the multinational command, and it may cause divisions among the participants. Now, the final challenge I wanted to talk about today is interoperability. And it's interoperability in terms of procedures and in terms of technology. So cooperation is, of course, much, much easier within an established structure, for example, NATO, where rules, procedures, equipment are all standardized. It may also be easier, for example, within the same cultural background. So, for example, for Anglo-Saxon countries, we could think that it may be a little bit easier. And it should not come as a surprise that even under the very same circumstances, the cooperation will be easier for some countries and for some not. And for example, during their involvement in Afghanistan, during ISAF, the cooperation between Swedish and British or Swedish and Norwegian Air Force went rather smoothly, while their relations with the German units proved to be more difficult because they had quite different practices in place and they were focusing on different goals. So one factor that could be hindering the interoperability is the adherence to national regulations and national procedures in a multinational team. For example, during the Polish involvement in the ISAF mission, one of the major problems that the Polish Air Force encountered was transporting cargo from home air bases to Afghanistan. And it was related to the lack of necessary regulations allowing for transporting weapons So Poland couldn't transport missiles, grenades, or explosives on their military transport aircraft. They could only transport rifles and flare ammunition. And that was because at that time, Poland adhered to the International Air Transport Association regulations. In practice, that meant that the Polish Air Force was unable to provide the contingent with necessary equipment. So a decision had to be made to change the existing regulations and to align them with procedures outlined in the USAF manual and NATO standards, which will effectively allow for transportation of majority of weapons. Another factor is experience, and experience in adhering to common procedures of a coalition, experience of acting in a way that is expected in a coalition. At the time of their involvement in Afghanistan, the Polish Air Force was still relatively new to NATO. And as such, they were still learning to adhere to the binding procedures. And as pointed out by one of my interviewees, one of the major things that the Polish Air Force had no or very little experience in was the cooperation between the air component and the ground forces. For example, that involved calling for close air support. So practicing these abilities and establishing relevant posts was required to enable the Polish Air Force to cooperate with NATO members more efficiently and at a more advanced level. Now, as I already said, communication is crucial for smooth cooperation. And as you would expect, there are security protocols for sharing data between coalition members. In case of NATO, as in any other established military alliance, all members must ensure that their network can receive and send information according to set standards. And that could be a problem for states, for air forces, from outside of that alliance. So again, an example here is Sweden and their experience from Libya. It took a month for the Swedish Air Force to get access to NATO data exchange systems because the necessary security protocols weren't in place. And that caused serious disruptions in the workflow because the Swedish coalition could not read any ATOs, any air tasking orders, and they had to depend on the Danish component to share that knowledge with them, to share that these documents with them. And the Swedish Air Force, they weren't even able to read their own reports because it was processed through the NATO system, which they didn't have access to. So that was the procedural incompatibility. But they also experience interoperability on the technical level because during that initial phase of Operation Unified Protector, they encountered issues with fuel compatibility. The fuel provided at Sigonella was suitable for use on aircraft carriers, but not compatible with Swedish Gripens. And that created a serious diplomatic and logistical challenge of transporting the correct fuel from Sweden to Italy in a convoy. So all of these above disruptions, they delayed the integration of Swedish component into the operation. And it is quite obvious that interoperability of the systems and procedures are absolutely essential. Now, as a final factor, I wanted to hint to financial constraints because they are another potential challenge in creating and maintaining interoperability. And they are specifically significant for small air forces. Of course, well, compatible systems and procedures, they are at the heart of every successful multinational military operation. But those systems are highly advanced, and what comes with that, very expensive. So for these small air forces, such as, for example, Poland, this poses a twofold problem. So first, they may be able to afford only a limited amount of such equipment. And secondly, these highly valuable assets, especially if they are possessed only in a small capacity, may in fact become a vulnerability because they may require an extra effort to make sure that they are not destroyed or damaged, seriously damaged in an operation. So for some, it's impossible to afford it all. Okay, so to conclude, let me restate that even though I try to discuss these challenges separately, they very rarely happen this way. As you had an opportunity to already see, they will be very much interdependent. They will often lead one to another. And as much as these difficulties are unavoidable, they can be mitigated. And that process has been taking place in Europe since 1990. And it happens on both informal and formal level. So as long as participants in a multinational operation are aware of the cultural differences, and instead of trying to eradicate them or ignore them, they know how this should be addressed, cooperation will steadily improve. So, for example, British senior commanders noted the significance of establishing good relations with members of the multinational unit and their command. So they suggested that, for example, visits to foreign contingents were prioritized over the British ones. And they suggested organizing social meetings within these units. Also, the Swedish way, the way how they were handling their duties in Libya, their diligence of following regulations, and their willingness to participate in social gatherings had a very positive effect on the integration of the Swedish Air Force with other members of the coalition in Libya. And similarly, a very important factor is the proactive behavior at that informal level, where coalition members, they facilitate the cooperation towards the common objective. And let me recall here the example of Sweden being denied access to NATO data exchange systems in Libya. That situation was saved by the Danish unit, which for the first weeks acted as a link between the Swedish contingent and the mission's joint command. And according to my interviewee, within an hour after his arrival, the commander of the Swedish contingent was approached by the commander of the Danish unit and offered help to share the necessary operational data and information until they gained full access to the system. So the willingness to improve interpersonal relations and awareness of potential differences within a multinational setting is an important way of developing cooperation on an informal level. And of course, well, there are also formally established frameworks to learn from one another and increase participation in various forms of multinational cooperation, whether these are expeditionary missions, exchange of services and burden sharing programs, or simply training and exercises, will progressively improve performance and limit the occurrence of potential difficulties. So the more an air force works together with other air forces, the more capable they are of that cooperation. But the role of the established structures such as NATO or EU is significant not only because they facilitate those various forms of cooperation, but they also help they are also working towards identifying gaps and limitations of their members' air forces. They are prioritizing the needs within an alliance, and they are streamlining the cooperation process with unified rules, procedures, exactly to ensure interoperability. And, or primarily, they provide a framework to build on, because well-established political relations between interested states are crucial for a well-developed and effective cooperation at military level. So the countries must be willing to participate in multinational operations or multinational training and work on increasing the interoperability of their own forces with other nations. So you could ask me now, where do small air forces fit here? Because I was supposed to talk about them. These challenges I just discussed are not applicable only to small air forces. And in fact, as you could see, to illustrate my points, I freely used examples of larger air forces. So what point I'm trying to make here? Well, first of all, the 4 categories of potential challenges I've just detailed are in no way exclusive to small air forces. But there's one important point I'd like to draw your attention to, which makes these challenges especially hard for the smaller partners. We should remember that among the challenges, there are financial constraints which limit countries' participation in multinational operations. And they underlie every single one of the categories I just mentioned. So especially smaller air forces, they face the choice of, for example, spending their defense budget on extensive training and exercises with NATO at the expense of procurement. Or they may be facing the choice of prioritizing the purchase of advanced equipment compatible with that used by the partners, but at the expense of improving the qualifications and interoperability of their personnel through NATO training and exercises. And as I said, these challenges, they are ongoing. They require constant training, constant upgrades. And of course, well, there are cost and burden sharing initiatives which seem a perfect solution, for example, for the problem of equipment. But there may still be situations when a state may not be able to afford sending its air forces to a particular training or other multinational program. After all, national capabilities are still considered as at least equally important, if not more important, as the multinational ones. Therefore, states may be very careful to strike a balance between national defense budgets and expenses towards the participation in multinational cooperation. And with that not very optimistic point, I'd like to finish my presentation today. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. Absolutely fascinating talk. Really interesting. I appreciated all the nuance that you put into it, and we already have a couple of questions. So we have about half an hour for questions and answers. And so I will take the question that was asked first. by Alan Ashby. He's asking in relation to a language and the French, which can be a bit of a touchy subject sometimes. So at one time, the French were resistant to English being the universal aviation language. Are they now okay with it? My personal guess is they are not, but they sort of have to live with it. What is the answer, Maria?
Well, I wasn't looking in that detail at the French Air Force, so I'm afraid I'm not able to answer that question, but my guess would be very similar to yours.
Yeah, typically it's a bit like I can assume the francophone Belgians and the francophone Swiss, they were also not the happiest ones. But yes. Now, next question by Bill Strandberg. The Royal Australian Air Force made a decision a while ago to purchase and operate the same time and version of aircraft as flown by the US forces. This was to aid operations, maintenance, and upgrades in step with the US. Is this approach viable with those forces who purchase aircraft systems from other countries? Same Rafales as flown by French forces, same as Swedish with the Gripens, etc., and so
on. Right. Yes. Well, as I said at the very beginning, U.S. Air Force, they are sort of a standalone category of air forces. So effectively, any other air forces that cooperate with them, or that want to cooperate with them, they need to take into consideration the compatibility issues. Sorry. But interestingly, as you mentioned, the purchasing the same type and version of aircraft, well, if it's the same type and version, it's of course it should be quite straightforward. But I think there's 11 nations now participating in the F-35 program, and some of them are purchasing very different versions. So we could probably ask the question here: what about interoperability and compatibility here between those different versions? Well, this is the same aircraft, but we are taking this and you are leaving out that. So it doesn't necessarily say that the interoperability will be reached here. So with the other systems purchased from other countries like Rafales or Gripens, yes, most likely there will be interoperability issues. For example, we could see, I think it was in Kosovo, in Operation Enduring Freedom, when the air-to-air refueling was provided mostly by the British and the US. And even though the British provided, I think, over 80% of the all refueling, their tankers weren't compatible with some of the US aircraft, so they couldn't help them, and they couldn't refuel. So even in the most advanced air forces, there will still be some incompatibilities, and we just have to anticipate those. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Maria. Now we have the next question, sort of also related to procurement, by Geoffrey Allen Wardle. With Poland, Switzerland and Finland purchasing 5th generation F-35As, as well as Germany and Italy, what will their position be on the 6th generation Tempest or FCAS? Will they be able to afford them in any numbers? This is quite an early question, I must say, and I'm quite curious what Maria's going to say about it, because, in Switzerland, for instance, I mean, it's still not yet entirely certain whether they will get the F-35. So
I was going to say that, well, maybe let them get it first and then start thinking about the 6th generation. To be honest, I really don't know, because, well, as Marco just said, well, they don't even have the 5th generation yet. So I don't know. I'm sorry.
Well, thank you for the honest answer. Yeah, I mean, this is a really interesting one. I think there's still a lot of debate
absolutely.
about what can 6th generation do, then 5th plus and whatever, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that's the thing, Well, the developments, they happen so quickly, and the systems, the platforms are going out of use or going outdated so quickly. That's the other challenge for especially for the smaller ones. By the time they are able to afford and train and operate the new equipment, it's already outdated, and there's something else that they need to look into just to maintain that interoperability.
Yeah, thank you very much. If I may have a quick follow-up question here, because this is like we don't have too many in the pipeline. In relation to that, I think what would be interesting here is to ask the question in relation to fifth generation aircraft and small air force procuring them. So typically, countries such as Switzerland and so on, who sometimes just use these aircraft for air policing, not much more than that at times. So do you think they actually are buying too sophisticated aircraft that they are not able to fully exploit, or are they buying the right aircraft? What do you think then?
Well, I think they're buying the right one, because, if they didn't, then their compatibility and interoperability is significantly hindered. And of course, when they buy the aircraft, the training comes with it, and they basically they need to be able to operate that. I think the very valid point here, maybe what I mentioned at the very end of my presentation, that sometimes because they are not able to afford them in the capacity that they would wish, just because the financial constraints, sometimes it may turn into vulnerability that they have to be careful with how they are using that expensive bit of equipment, that they do not have in a capacity, in a large capacity.
Thank you. Okay, so we have two other questions. I will first take the one by just T. There's not much more of a name than that. And then we go back to Bill's second question. So did these issues exist in the Warsaw Pact, or was it easier with more standardized equipment and possibly being taught to use equipment in a standard Russian?
Yes, not sure if it was easier. Of course, the equipment was Russian, basically, and the requirements, they were quite strict. I didn't do much of a research on the end of the Cold War period, but I did some archival research looking for various various bits, and I found a most interesting document, which was basically saying that one officer in the Polish Air Force, it was probably like in the 70s, early 70s, was being punished because he wasn't willing to the desirable extent to learn Russian or speak Russian. So there wasn't much choice, to be honest, when you were operating within the Russian and speaking Russian. And of course, the equipment was Russian, and there was quite a lot of also Russian officers and personnel stationed in Poland. To the extent that at some point it was even difficult for the Polish officers to get to certain ranks. But I would expect that there will still some incompatible. Sorry, they weren't still compatible. Sorry, it's right.
Thank you. Okay, so Bill, next question. The German Luftwaffe Force has balked at upgrading various electronic systems, including the modern secure IFF systems. This increases the threat to their aircraft and reduces interoperability with the other upgraded forces. Does this limit their capability within NATO?
It potentially can. Well, I don't have the technical knowledge to answer this question, specifically, but potentially it could limit the capability within NATO. Well, if they are not compatible with the NATO systems. However, well, of course, they are part of NATO, so they have to work towards certain standards and maintain certain level of this compatibility. The example that I mentioned with Sweden, it was a different case because, well, of course, they were the outsider; they weren't coming from within the alliance. So, the system they were using and the security protocols, it had to be established. To be honest, one of my interviewees even said that, well, they felt somewhat like going backwards when they had to switch to NATO systems, and because, well, they had their own ones which were, they felt, more advanced. But, well, this is what they were required to do.
Thank you. Then we have a question from David Ruddleston. Given the Danish help noted, would attempts to program regional forces together be a low-cost benefit? So would deliberately combining, for instance, Scandinavian or Iberian or Baltic or even Polish and so on, or Balkan air forces be useful? I think this is an interesting question. Of course, this relates to minilateralism that is ongoing in Europe, on land and so on too. But yes, Maria, please, what do you say about minilateralism?
Well, I don't think there is a chance for, like multinational air force or something like that. But this sort of regional cooperation is already taking place. We have a very good example in the Scandinavia with Nordefco and with an initiative they have between Sweden, Norway, and Finland, which is called cross-border training. And this is a program where the three countries decided just to come together, and they are using their shared airspace to perform trainings and exercises, and they don't need any legal approval from Stockholm or whoever. They can just go there, train together, and learn how to cooperate with each other. So these programs are already taking place, and yes, they are a way to lower the costs, because the countries, they commit themselves. It's not a big operation. It's just their willingness just to cooperate and train and save also on as if they as if they were training individually. So yes, absolutely.
Thank you. Okay, so another question we have here, that's an interesting one. Yes, the misunderstanding between English-speaking people. How much trouble has been caused by the British and American forces thinking they speak the same language when actually they don't really?
Well, I didn't look at the US, so I seriously, honestly, don't know if there were any challenges between the British and American forces. But it really struck me, to be honest, unexpectedly, that it can be a problem for the English native speakers to have to experience the language barrier, because it's not something that I would expect. And since then, I also started asking myself if there were, for example, problems with if there was a pilot from, I don't know, Yorkshire and France, how much trouble they had, because, well, of course, the taught English is quite very different from the spoken one, and some things like regional accents and some pronunciation, it's not that easy to eradicate. But well, the American and British, it's a really interesting point. Yeah, I should definitely look into that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. It's, of course, that relates to your current project of it's not just language, that
Yes.
culture encompasses with strategic culture, that feeds then into strategic culture, of course.
Absolutely. That's why I said, well, this is, only scratching the surface here, because, well, it's such a broad subject. I did start it during my PhD, and I just found that, well, it's way too broad, and it's way too much to discover in that, and there's too many questions, to be contained in one chapter. So yes, I'm really looking forward to this project, and hopefully I will be able to come back here with some conclusions.
Yeah, that'd be fantastic. Now, I see there's a comment by Bill that he believes he just saw Nordic countries purchasing common uniform between the 3 countries Maria just mentioned. Do you want to?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I didn't know that, but it's very possible. Yeah, because, well, it's a really close cooperation between the NORDEFCO countries, and especially the cross-border training group. So I wouldn't be, surprised if they actually decided for that.
Thank you. Now, are there any other questions? Well, perhaps people are thinking to ask another.
Marco, you froze. I'm not sure.
I'm loath to come in, Maria, because first of all, I've got my speaker on the other computer. Sorry, I'm loath to come in because I feel Marco might come back, and I've already interrupted him once. So
yeah, I think he's coming back.
Okay, you will have to let me know.
I'm back. Was I frozen? Yeah. Am I back?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I think I'm half frozen again. I don't know what the internet is not great. Can you hear me okay now?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, fantastic. Let's hope it's going to stay that way for the remaining minutes. So because there's another question I would like to ask, a quick one. So because we were looking at sort of multinational operations, and the problem that Europe faces often is that in who brings what to the table, whether it's on land, sea, air, because many countries have less and less to bring to the table, right? In line, of course, with their national strategies, defense policies, and so on. So I was wondering, to what extent do you think that European, especially the smaller countries, will be able to continue to bring actually something to the table, or are they also less willing to bring something to the table for national prerogatives? And so how do you see sort of the capabilities of small air forces evolving in the future?
Right. So I have touched on that in my research project. We could see in the post-Cold War Europe that there is an increasing what is called like transnationalizations of the air forces or the military in general, and that is because many of the European countries, they cannot afford maintaining the full capabilities, whether it's army, air force, navy, whichever service. So they often decide on specializing into something and then relying on the rest of the alliance, or if they are within NATO, or the alliance as well if they are not, like in case of Sweden. Well, they maintain their non-allied status, but they are still reliant on that structure. So yes, they will most likely continue bringing something to the table. It may be that they are specializing in one area or another. Most likely, they will try to afford some equipment to be able to, perform some different roles or different tasks, but it won't be, it won't mean that they are able to perform them independently and for a long time. So so they will still have these capabilities, but not as a full operational long-term capability. But I think the specialization is a very real prospect for European militaries. And the other one is the concentration. So they are becoming smaller because the budgets are smaller. We are seeing the move from the mass armies to professional armies. But because they are getting smaller, it doesn't mean that they are getting weaker, because again, they are often investing in that one particular section. So this is a very interesting thing that is taking place because, well, of course, well, we have the different budget cuts, and generally European states, especially smaller ones, are not able to afford full spectrum, but they are looking for ways, to rely on each other and to be able to bring something significant to the pool. And of course, there are different, programs and initiatives where pooling and sharing is the way to go, like with airlift or refueling. We've got the ATARES initiative, which is, I think, is brilliant because, the involved states, they pool from airlift and air-to-air refueling resources. And then whatever they put into that, they can take the same amount of hours, but not necessarily the same capability. So, for example, if they gave airlift, they may need air-to-air refueling, so they are being given that by the other participants. So it's a very broad subject, but yes, specialization, concentration, and pooling sharing initiatives definitely are the way forward.
Thank you very much. Then I think we have one last question here from the audience. I don't know whether you want to answer because it's a very specific one. Have you found examples of language differences? For instance, the word for fire sounds like a board in another language.
No.
Okay, I thought so. I just thought, we take all questions here, as many as we can. Then we have actually a question here that's from Harry, isn't it? What do you think the American perspective is on the challenges small air forces face, particularly when it comes to limitations or at least differences in equipment and resources when compared to the United States?
Well, there was a case when the US tried to take the backseat in Libya, and it turns out that, well, it's very difficult to be able to conduct the operation without them. So I would say for the sustainability of an operation and the missions, they are needed wherever it is. But these smaller air forces can also be very desired partner. Because first of all, well, they can bring something. It won't, take a massive burden of the US, but they will bring something. And that's also closely linked to the nature of multinational operations. I said that, well, they are increasingly popular or a dominant form of military operations because of the shrinking budget, new irregular threats, and so on and so on. But another reason for their popularity or their the fact that they are the dominant form of operations is the fact that they also provide some legitimacy to the operation. So the more nations takes part in a venture, the more legitimate it may look.
Mm-hmm.
So
thank you very much.
The challenges, they will be there, but it's also about the political gains, as usually.
Ultimately, it's politics determining a lot of things, isn't it? Okay, so well, thank you so much. It's been a wonderful talk. I think we don't have any other questions, so therefore, we're also approaching a certain time where people are getting hungry or need a drink. Of course, depending on the time zone, depending where you are, perhaps you don't want to start drinking now. So thank you very much, Maria, for really a fascinating talk and all your insights and really, all the knowledge you have. So I would like to thank you, of course, on behalf of the Royal Air Force Museum and Harry, and of course also Center for War and Diplomacy. And we hope to host you in the future in person at Lancaster University. Many thanks also, of course, to the audience. We're numerous in attending, and I hope you enjoyed it, and apologies for all the technical difficulties. At the beginning, they were not on my end, but eventually they ended up being on my end, so sorry for that. I'm abroad, so I don't have the best internet as I usually have. So anyway, I hope it was enjoyable nevertheless for the audience and for Maria, and many thanks again, Maria, for your talk tonight.
Well, thank you for having me here. It was a great pleasure.